Good afternoon. As all of you know, struck in this world was shocked and saddened by the sudden and unexpected death of Miller Mair. We quickly organized a symposium in remembrance of Miller. This consists of a bunch of very short papers, 4 presentations of pictures and things like that. I'm starting the symposium with reading 2 papers. The first one is one I have written, and the second one is one that old personal construct psychologist Al Landfield has written. So that's where we'll start. New glasses, they don't work right. I first met Miller Mair at the Hub, the University of Florida bookstore, in the spring of 1972. At the time, I was an eager undergraduate working with Franz Epting on a project involving personal construct psychology and death threat. There's a whole story there that we won't be able to get into today. A portion of this project was going to be my undergraduate honors thesis. I was naturally curious about anything related to construct psychology, as I was just learning about the theory. When I saw Bannister and Mair's The Evaluation of Personal Constructs, I bought a copy. Immediately, I had my first exposure to the issues and the complexities of the repertory grid, as that was the basis of the entire book. Keep in mind that at the time, one could not buy Kelly's volumes. So the only real Kelly I had read was the paperback of the first 3 chapters, as well as Brendan Marr's edited volume. Neither of these said very much about the repertory grid. While the grid appealed to the part of me that was a math major, it seemed to me to be lacking in the highly personal psychology that I saw in the Marr volume. Nevertheless, my first introduction to Miller was Miller the Grid Expert from the Bannister and Mair volume. After graduating from Florida, I went to the University of Nebraska to work with Al Landfield. At the time, Al had just published his landmark studies into premature termination and psychotherapy, and was working on a repertory grid measure of construct system ordination. I became immersed in the nuances of the grid. Over the next few years, as I fulfilled the many requirements of a PhD in clinical psychology, my path did not intersect further with Miller's writings. Al was organizing the Nebraska Symposium on Motivation in Personal Construct Psychology. The symposium was held in the fall of '76, and Al had invited scholars from all over the United States and Europe to speak. Miller Mair was one of the invited speakers. I remember settling down into my seat to hear Miller's talk. I was anticipating a continuation both of the themes of the Bannister and Mair book, as well as the various mathematical ways of measuring construct relatedness that had been the hallmark of the entire conference thus far. I could not have been more surprised. Miller's talk, Metaphors for Living, was both an intellectual masterpiece as well as highly personal. This integration of a brilliant intellect with a personal psychology became the hallmark of Miller's writing, in my opinion. While you could see glimpses of this combination prior to the Nebraska Symposium, for example, his piece, Psychologists Are Human Too, published in 1970, I believe the talk at Nebraska brought Miller's ability to combine these facets to the high point he maintained throughout his career. It was the only time in my life that I have seen someone get standing ovation at a professional conference. You may say something about the conferences I attend. My associations with Miller then went in 3 directions. First, I was an avid reader of his work, and Ones that I would cite in particular were the community of self, the long quest to know, the personal venture, telling psychological tales, and his volume on poetics and psychotherapy. In all of his work, I continue to see the brilliant integration of psychological scholarship reflected in a personal writing style. Second, I was teaching and supervising in the area of experiential constructivist approaches to psychotherapy. So I often assigned Miller's work in my classes. My students had the same reaction to his writing that I had. As a matter of fact, it became a joke among us that he was sort of a personal hero to them, and how much they admired Miller's work as compared to my own. When I first took students to Australia, these students were stunned to hear Australian students eager to learn what it was like to work with me. Shocked, my students told me that quote, the Australians seem to feel about you the way we feel about Miller. So perhaps it was not so much of a joke after all. The third way Miller and I associated was at professional conferences. Miller was a stroller, and when we attended the same conference, we would always make sure we took a walk together one afternoon. These always were the high point of the conference and will be my most cherished memories of him. We would talk about life, relationships, and psychology. I particularly valued the ways he would critique my work. My papers would improve markedly between presentation and publication because of these critiques. I also spent a lot of money buying books he would recommend. Finally, it drove my graduate students crazy that I got to spend an afternoon with him one-on-one, and they did not. I last saw Miller and met Ingrid, his wife, at the conference in Niagara Falls last year. Is it any wonder that a conference organized by my students would invite Miller to be the keynote speaker and give him a Lifetime Achievement Award? I had not seen him in many years since his retirement, and it was good to be together again. Two things really stood out for me at the conference. One was Miller commenting about how he had not been to a single paper using the repertory grid. And after a pause, he said, and isn't that refreshing? So much for my first constructions of the man as Miller the grid expert. The second experience that stood out for me was talking with him at breakfast on the third day of the conference. He looked tired, and when I commented on it, he said that he had barely slept. Ingrid then looked at me and said, quote, it's your fault. The day before, I had presented a paper on some reflections about Kelly's concept of an integral universe. Miller felt so stimulated by the paper, he was up most of the night mulling over its implications. I was touched that I could write a paper that would do to Miller what his writing has done for me so often. We stayed in email contact after Niagara Falls. Every few weeks, he would write me about the integral universe implications, pushing me to really take on some of the paths I had opened. Should I pursue those implications, I will owe yet another debt to this wonderful man. I hear him, even today, urging me to have the courage to go in certain directions. So even after death, he is helping me to shape my papers, making them better than what they would have been. What more could you ask of someone who has been a mentor and a colleague in every sense of those terms? That's mine. When I called Al Vanfield and told him Miller's death, he was shocked. He made Kubler-Ross first stage. He just said, no, can't be true. Same thing Franz said. And then Al wrote this thing titled My Friend Miller Mair. So this is Al Vanfield. I believe the year was 1966. My wife Jean, I, and my two children, Kent and Megan, had just disembarked from a Dutch ship in Southampton Harbor. 4 hands were waving to us from behind a fence. The hands belonged to Miller Mair and Don Bannister. They had come to transport us to a hotel in London. After a prolonged inspection of our baggage by customs officials, we were in the capable hands of our luggage bearers. I protested as they insisted that I not help them load something called a shooting brake. Back home, it was called a station wagon. Prior to our departure from Southampton, Miller and Don were confronted by a barrage of questions from our children. They patiently answered their questions. This was our first trip overseas. I think Jean and I were in a state of shock. We suddenly realized that this was not just a guided tourist trip. It was to be our home during the coming year. Miller and Don had done a lot of work in preparation for our visit. Miller had arranged schools for the children. Don had arranged for a car lease. They also arranged our hotel stay for 10 days. After that, Miller and Don would transport us to our flat. We came to know it as our digs, a word that I enjoyed. I thought about my foxholes in France. While Don acted as captain of the ship, Miller attended to the kids. His approach to them, warm and patient, also showed his enjoyment of humor. He liked the kids and they liked him. I now will share an example of Miller's humor that delighted me. Miller was sitting on my patio in Lincoln, Nebraska. He suddenly turned to me, quote, "We have known each other for 20 years.